All right. Welcome back to the BJKS podcast. I am not your host. I am Cody Kommers. But I'm here with the host of the podcast, usually, Benjamin Coopersmith. And Ben and I have done a couple episodes together for his show. Really enjoy talking to one another. And we're going to do something a little bit different today. Instead of him interviewing me or someone else, I will talk to him on this, the 50th show that he has produced. And we're going to talk a little bit about what he's learned, what I've learned, maybe will come up a little bit as well. We'll talk about sort of his vision for the show in the future and what he'd like to do sort of in the second year, the second, sort of the next version of it. And we'll talk about, what PhD students can do to like the pros and cons and the strategies for them starting their own shows and just all the things that we find interesting about doing podcasts along the way. So that's sort of the general idea, and I've got a little bit of a roadmap for us, starting off with a few general questions and then moving sort of section by section through some of the key points that I think are worth talking about in this space of things. How's that sound today, Ben?
It sounds great. Thank you, Cody. I mean, it seems like whenever you come on, the show just gets about 3 times more professional than it is when I do it on my own with a guest. That was a very good introduction.
Awesome. Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation. So let's get into it. Like I said, there's a couple just sort of general questions that I want to start off with. And, just framing generally how you've thought about this show from the beginning and before and up until now. So the first thing I'm curious to sort of hear about is, what were your goals when you were starting this podcast? How did you conceptualize what you're doing? That sort of thing.
I don't know. I guess it was it was probably a mixture of things. To some extent, I've just always liked these kind of podcasts, and I've listened to them since maybe 2013, 14, something like that. So I guess I've just always thought it would be a really cool idea to do something like this and to be able to ask the questions yourself of people. At least whenever I listen to interviews, it's always like, oh, why did he ask that question? Here's a much cooler question I would have thought of. But yeah, I guess that was part of it. Then, yeah, I mean, for me, the main thing was really that I wanted to talk to people about the science they do. And a lot of it was basically that you'd read a paper and then, okay, you have lots of questions, but you don't really know what to do with it. You might ask your supervisor or talk to some colleagues about it or something like that. But often at least when I read a paper, it just kind of ends there. Nothing happens with it. But you have lots of questions you like answered. So I thought it would be really cool if I could just talk to the people who actually do the paper. And, every once in a while you can do because they give a talk somewhere where you are or because you happen to meet them in whatever function. But that's basically never the case, let's be honest. And so I just wanted to have a way to talk to the people about their work and maybe also, meet new people. I guess I started this right around the beginning of the pandemic, which was largely coincidental. But I guess that was a really good time point for starting it because I guess despite the pandemic, I still managed to meet, like 30 people or something by now who I probably wouldn't have met otherwise. So I think it was this 2 parts of maybe some like slight networking and also just learning more about the papers I was already reading and books I was reading and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's sort of keep that question and your answer to it sort of in the background throughout this conversation, because I think that sort of frames a lot of what we're going to talk about in terms of, well, what should I produce? How much time should I spend producing it? That sort of stuff. Right, a lot of those questions I think come back to, well, I don't know, what do you want to get out of it? Like that sort of thing. So I think that's a good baseline for it.
Yeah, I guess it's also slightly changed because, I've also then started doing some, as you know, book discussions.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. And I guess that's not exactly part of the initial plan. I guess it was more kind of slightly expanding what I was doing. But I guess it's still in the same vein of something I would have done anyway and just trying to do that on a slightly more in-depth level and more detailed level.
Absolutely. So a sort of related question, but a substantively different one is, how has producing this show been different than what you expected? What was sort of like how you imagined it going in versus how it actually has asked of you to participate in it? What is the sort of biggest delta there?
There's the question you advised me to say when you were a guest on my show.
Yeah, I think
I was wondering when that was going to come.
yeah. Just for the context there, for anyone who hasn't
Yeah.
listened to that one, it's this question that I ripped off of Ira Glass, the famous podcaster slash radio host of This American Life, and he said the most useful question that he's ever come across is, how did that turn out differently than you thought? Which is, because it gives both a story and a theory. It's sort of like, okay, here's what I thought was going to happen based on my theory of the world. Here's what actually happened, and then I updated my theory of the world. However, the update that I have for you since that initial episode is that I listened to another interview with Ira Glass recently, and it turns out he's never asked that question himself. Someone else told him that was a useful question. He's like, yeah, that's a totally useful question. And then he's never used it in his... Anyway.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think it's still the theory behind it still holds. Yeah. So let's hear your perspective on that.
I guess there's a bunch of things, right? The first is that, as with most things in life, it takes more time than you think it will. So I guess, especially, I didn't initially think the startup cost would be quite as high. I think I kind of thought like, okay, I'll have a few people who I will ask, mainly friends and colleagues and that kind of stuff. And then I'll just start. But then I didn't realize, basically, in the week leading up to me saying I was going to publish the first episode, I think I spent most of that week, designing the logo, finding some way to upload it, and changing the logo again because it was slightly different formats, and just all this kind of annoying small things that you just don't expect to happen. But I guess, so podcasting, like everything else, does take twice as long as you think it will take. So that's one part. To some extent, actually, the initial format I had doesn't work as well as I thought it would. So initially, my plan was really to say, okay, I've read the paper. Obviously, my guest has written the paper, and I'm kind of assuming the readers or the listeners have read the paper also. And then I'm going to ask the questions that you can't get just from reading the paper, kind of going beyond the paper. And I initially thought like it would be really cool if I could just do that and get rid of all the like summarizing the paper. Like, you've read the paper, you know what's in it. But then as I was doing that more and more, I realized that just doesn't really work. Because for one, I realized, and that's, my recent episode, I usually let people summarize the paper for 2 minutes or something like that. I realized that that's very useful as a reminder for me and the guest probably to just get into what we're talking about. Yeah, so I think it's, to some extent, I've realized that these like super technical in-depth things are actually, number one, really hard to do, and number two, not that much fun to listen to. So because of that, in recent episode, I've tried to kind of not make it more mainstream. This is still not science communication in that sense, but to make it more the kind of thing that, let's say, you might present in front of a department rather than a one-on-one discussion about technical details. And I think that's been really useful, and also, yeah, I hope more interesting and also less work. What else? I guess finding guests has been very different than I expected. So I initially expected, we talked about this when I interviewed you. I initially expected that 80% of the people would say no. I just thought basically like maybe even more. I thought like everyone would say, no, leave me alone, you idiot. Or just ignore me. But as it turns out, about half of the people say yes. Of those, I find there's about 5% maybe of people who say yes and then nothing actually happens. But in general, roughly half the people actually say yes that I ask. So that's really cool. And encouraging also. And I've got a lot of feedback, positive feedback from guests who I've interviewed who said that they really liked that I was doing this and that kind of stuff, which I thought I was just going to be a nuisance for the guests, basically. They're like, fine, I'll do it. But apparently a lot of people actually like this. Yeah, I guess those were probably like the main three ones I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, so speaking of startup costs, which I agree is a huge, like there's a lot you have to do before that first episode comes out. But is there anything you would have done differently before you start sort of in the lead up to it? Was there, either in terms of, like you said, the sort of framings of those initial episodes, or getting certain stuff right before is there anything you would have done differently like that?
I guess one thing I would definitely do is to reduce the amounts of different things I'm doing. So I think in the When I started off, I also, I guess, inspired by people like Friedman and his podcast. I thought what would be really cool is if I have, my podcast and I put it on YouTube. I only have audio, but I'll still put it on YouTube and I'll take like small clips of it and put that, so that's a really great way. I think that people get to know about your podcast and that kind of stuff, and is a really cool format. I think also if you have like 5 minutes, you can watch a clip rather than having to listen to the entire interview. And so that was kind of my initial plan. So I started putting the videos on YouTube and that kind of stuff. But then obviously no one watches a YouTube video that's just sound. And that wasn't really the plan either. But so basically, I think I still have the first 5 episodes on YouTube or something like that. But like no one looked at them basically. So I think I should have just scrapped that entire idea. Like you can start later on, but I think it's probably a good idea to start small and say, okay, I'm going to have the podcast and Twitter. Right, so now I have the podcast and some sort of way of advertising it, and that would have saved me like a few hours probably trying to set up the YouTube channel and converting it to video and all these kind of annoying things. Yeah, maybe that's the general thing. Just try and keep it simple, because I guess I initially looked at this like successful podcasts and thought, okay, I'm going to do what they do, assuming, but obviously they didn't start off delivering like the whole package. They started off a lot smaller. So yeah, I think probably focusing on just, I guess the whole Pareto 80-20 thing, just focus on like the 2-3 things that really matter, which I guess would be having the podcast, having a Twitter and a logo. I think that's pretty much all you need. Actually podcast name. I guess I chose the least creative one imaginable.
But isn't there a difference between logistically what you need, like literally what you need in terms of like an RSS feed and a logo and all this sort of stuff, versus the stuff that matters, right? Which is getting good guests on and having some sort of format that gets the most out of them and the questions. So, I mean, there's 2 different ways of defining the small basis set of what matters, right?
Yeah, I guess like everything, right? You have to start somewhere and you'll figure out what doesn't work or what does work.
But we'll get into lots of what does work, what you would like to have work. So like we'll sort of set that aside for now. But you mentioned something else, which is the first section, the sort of like big section that I want to talk about, which is other podcasts. So you mentioned Lex Friedman as someone you look up to, and so I want to know which podcasts do you listen to on a regular basis, and who as a host and what shows have influenced you.
Well, I mean, this is, of course, the very lame answer, but I do listen regularly to your podcast.
Which I very much appreciate.
Yeah, that is, I mean, that's literally why I interviewed you. So, I don't know, let's say I think nothing particularly unusual. I think it's the big interview-based podcasts that do long-form interview. So, none of them really. So,
like Joe Rogan? Like, what are the examples?
I used to listen to him for... Yeah, so Joe Rogan, but I guess, I haven't listened to a single episode since he switched to Spotify. And before then, it just got quite a lot less. But there was a period when I listened to a few of his. I think he is, despite all the memes and jokes about him, actually very good at what he does. Big surprise. The guy who's really successful is good at what he does. I think Tim Ferriss is also very good.
So let's start to break this down. So yeah, those are a couple big people who have some of the most
pretty
popular...
much the 2 biggest interview ones almost, I'd say, yeah.
Maybe you could also put someone like Sam Harris for us and our sort of interest.
Yeah,
in that.
I used to. I guess I've probably listened to most of those kind of big ones. I think Rich Roll is actually very good.
So let's take whichever one of those you want and say, well, what did you, besides just saying, oh, they're very good at it, what specifically did you take from them, or do you think you're good at, or do you try to emulate, or do you think is this sort of the key to their thing? Like pick whichever one you want, but I'd like to know like sort of that next level on what you get out of their content.
Weird thing is I have absolutely no idea. It seems like an obvious question I should have asked myself at some point. I don't know. I mean, I guess there's maybe 2 different ways to respond to this. The first is before I started a podcast, and the second is after I started a podcast. Because I guess also definitely before I started a podcast, I mean, I liked listening to them because of the guests, but I don't think I really liked any of the interviews per se. I think there were some, for example, I mean, Tim Ferriss just had lots of good guests on it, and I thought, he's all right, whatever. But I didn't really care too much about him. Same for any of the other podcasts. Like I never really listened to any of them really because of the podcast host or anything like that. It's basically just like who can get the guests that I find most interesting on the podcast.
Do you feel like there's a level of trust that you have with a particular host? So, for example, you might not like Tim Ferriss as an individual or find him that compelling, but you trust him to ask the kind of questions, or is it literally just put the interesting person in front of him and do that?
I mean, before I started the podcast, definitely. I think, after I've done that, I've realized how good they are, and I've paid more attention to what kind of questions they ask and that kind of stuff. But I think before then, it was really like a non-reflective, just like, that's an interesting guest, I'll listen to it, and if I like the conversation, then I'd listen to the end. Otherwise, I'd stop halfway through or whatever. I don't think. I guess, I mean, trust is maybe a slightly too strong word. I think you do have an expectation. For example, with Joe Rogan, I'd never listened to any of the comedian guests he have because they were always, or the fighter stuff, it was just always super boring. But no, yeah, to be honest, no. I think I've gone through this very uncritically and unreflectively. I think I've just, I don't know. Do you find that you really like certain interviews or something? I somehow always find, I don't know, like my mantra going in when doing this interview is like every interview is annoying. You're going to be annoying too. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to your position that like the best thing an interviewer can be is unobtrusive.
Like a referee, basically, yeah.
Yeah, and so I definitely have sort of tried to incorporate that into my own style by saying like, look, I'm going to ask the question and I'm just going to let the other person go on for as long as they want about it. Because 90% of the time when I'm listening to an interview, if the interviewer cuts the person off, no matter how well-intentioned they may be, I'm like, whoa, I was listening to that. I wanted to know where they were going to take with that. I really don't give a shit what you have to say. I'm not here for you. I'm here for the other person. So on the one hand, I get that. But on the other hand, yeah, I do think that the different strategies that they employ and the different kinds of questions they ask and what they're trying to do overall are really important. So one person, like the person that I think is the single best interviewer, if you had to just pick one and say, who's the greatest interviewer of all time? That's easy. It's Oprah. Because at the end of the day, one of the big things that an interview is about is creating space, right? So the difference between a person just going on mic and spouting off about whatever versus an actual fully fledged interview is that the interviewer's job is to create the space for the person to have the best opportunity to express what it is they want to express. And ain't no one out there who creates space like Oprah. That's what she does.
So just a brief question. What does she actually do? I know her name, and to be fair, I mainly know her as someone who has pseudoscientific dangerous people on her show and promotes them. That's mainly what I know, but I'm sure she's done hopefully something good. But I don't actually know what she has a TV show or something, right?
She had a TV show. So that was one of the biggest daytime television talk shows. I guess not technically a talk show. I don't know what you call that sort of format of it, but one of the daytime sort of like there's a host and there's people come on, they talk to them, that sort of stuff. Like multimedia empire, one of the richest women on the planet actually, from all of her sort of stuff. And yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that for people like you maybe look at that and look like that's total bullshit in terms of the content. But at the end of the day, she is able to get people to trust her, and not audience members necessarily like you and me, like I was talking about trust earlier, but trust in terms of, famous people who have a lot to lose. And if they're going to go on record as saying something, they want to have the most sympathetic audience possible. And she's able to create that space where there's a high stakes, revelation that's happening, whatever this person is sharing, whatever intimate personal details they're sharing. And she's going to simultaneously be able to sort of walk that line of probing, like, well, like me and the billion other people listening to this, we really want to hear these details. So let's go into it. Let's not shy away from it. But also the other people trust it. So she creates that space. And at the end of the day, I think what Joe Rogan does is very similar. So he is able to create quite a bit of good space, 3.5 hours at a time for his guests. And yeah, a lot of stuff that we sort of probably look at and be like, yeah, I'm not really like, it's not really my thing. It's kind of kooky, whatever. But he is able to create space, and he does so in a way that I think addresses basically what I think of when I think of as Joe Rogan is that he should be our new psychological cognitive scientific definition of the median intelligence. So Joe Rogan is not overly intelligent. He's not overly stupid. He is literally if you line up every person on the planet, from dumbest to smartest, Joe Rogan would be the exact middle person. And that's one of the reasons why he is able to have such a mainstream sort of following, is because he's able to create that space and occupy that exact middle of the ground, totally attainable level of intelligence for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, that's very fair, because I guess he does ask the dumb questions, but he can hold a conversation, right? He can talk about people. It's not just he asks a dumb question and doesn't get it.
No, he's not stupid. He's also not extremely smart. It's literally in the middle, and that's part of the key to it. So anyway, those are some of the things that I think about.
I just remembered one thing whilst you mentioned Oprah, just because I guess maybe it's television. I hadn't thought of television interviews at all until you mentioned Oprah. But I think one person who I really liked as an interviewer, and I think he's had some trouble with the Me Too movement, but Charlie Rose, I always really liked his interviews, and him.
Not familiar with him personally.
He's an American, I don't know. He had this, like, I only saw it on YouTube or whatever, and people would post like interviews that he did, and he basically had this, like, it was really minimalistic. It was him, a guest or two, and then just this big table, and behind them was just darkness, just blackness. So you literally just have these two people talking. And I think he would ask probably smarter questions and really try and get something intelligent out of the guests. I mean, he has some, he's actually one of the people where I remember him actually, I remember that the interview actually maybe brought something to the table, because there was this one, I was just doing something random, and I just put on some random episode you did, and it was with some golf instructor or something like that. I can't remember who it was or exactly, but I just remember listening and going, this, like, I'm really interested in golf now, just from listening to those two people. And I don't know exactly what it was about it. Maybe it was, just a great guest. But I did realize, like, oh yeah, this show is actually really making me listen to things that I might not listen to otherwise. And I guess that probably is the trust then that you talked about. You trust, even if you maybe don't know the guest per se, you think they're going to get good guests and get them to say something interesting.
And there's also a little bit of it's kind of like almost a familial relationship. Like, it's sort of how, like, with your family, like, they constantly annoy you, but you also... like, you need them, you love them, you do care about them at the end of the day. But that doesn't mean that you're not consistently sitting there being like, oh my God, can we just, right? So, like, I think that your relationship as an audience member to interviewers is sort of the same way, that it's like, yeah, this guy's a dipshit, but, like, you know, he's my dipshit, you know, like that sort of thing. You sort of take that on.
But I think I think I learned, like, the most from them was probably, like, stuff that just really annoyed me. For example, what I do, I basically take out any sound I make other than actual voice, because there were a few episodes of whatever, I don't know which podcast, where someone just kept going like, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And that just annoyed me so much.
So this is like something I learned from studying Malcolm Gladwell. Is there's an interview that he gave where that was one of the things that he learned when he started doing his podcast, Revisionist History, was that when he was doing interviews for books, he would, you know, sort of as a conversational technique, be like, yeah, okay, yep, throughout, which is a very normal thing a way to express that you're listening to somebody. And then he realized that when doing podcast audio, it ruined the, you know, audio dynamic, and that, like, he realized that was a tip. And so for the most part, I'm super conscious about being just, you know, like, be quiet while someone else is talking. So I don't have to take those out, and it doesn't come across in the other person's audio. If they tell a joke, you'll hear me giggle in the background, because otherwise they sound ridiculous, having just told a punchline and there's no laugh track to it. So that's the exception. But yeah, that was something that I was aware of from the beginning that I've consciously tried to employ.
Although I will say, I do actually say it, I just take it out in the edit. Because I feel like it does encourage the person to keep talking and not just feel like, am I boring?
Do you have a problem with that on podcasts? People keep talking. I'm pretty sure everyone keeps talking, regardless of. But you can also do it visually.
Maybe,
podcast,
I don't know.
Right?
Yeah, you could, but I just say
that's what I do. Is I like, you know, eyebrows up, eyes wide. You know, sort of like, yeah, keep going. But here's a question. So since we've established that you listen to my podcast and that you find every podcast interviewer annoying to some extent or another, Like
Where is this going? Yeah.
what's an example of something that that annoys you about what I do, or something that you think is a peculiar idiosyncrasy, something along those lines? What comes to mind?
So the thing that definitely came to mind very quickly, and it's not exactly about you, but it's about your editing, is that you don't take out stuff like and that kind of stuff. For example, as I said before we started recording, I listened to Nicole Barbara's or whatever interviews, and she actually only did it 3 times, I think, in the entire podcast, but twice in the first 5 minutes
I
or something like
see.
that. Which is, and that just annoys me to no end.
Yeah.
And similarly, I guess there's always this question: how much do you take out and that kind of stuff? And then you're opting for basically completely natural, as far as I can
Yeah,
tell.
I basically don't take anything out unless it really is some complete like rubbish.
Okay, but so the kind of and mouth noises and that kind of stuff, they are difficult to take out often, but it's quite clear that you don't even try to. At least that's what it seems like to me.
Yeah.
That's something that annoys me.
But no, tell me about me. What annoys you about me?
Wait, just to finish that point. Second
Yeah,
thing
yeah,
is
let's hear it.
when you ask a question, there's always, especially you ask people like, "Where did you grow up?" And then they answer, then you say, "Ah, okay, yeah, so." And I think, Cody, you could have just taken that out. Like, do I need to listen through that for the 20th time in a
Yeah.
row now? Yeah, okay. So that was just on the editing part. About you. I mean, nothing comes to mind right now immediately. I obviously disagree with some stuff you says, but that's not really annoying. That's just a difference of opinion. Yeah, like on the spot right now, I can't think of anything. If you want, I can let you know via email.
Let's put a
once
pin in
something
that,
comes
and
up.
if anything occurs to you over the next hour, then feel free to flag it, and we'll bring it back up.
I'll try and think of something. There must be something annoying about you. I'm sure I can find it.
But yeah, so I guess so. We've sort of waded into the territory of the second sort of big thing that I want to talk about, and that's interviewing, and questions like what are the goals of your interview, and what do you think makes for a good interview, and the style of interview that you want to do. So, what are your setting aside who you're emulating and who you're taking it from? Sure. How do you conceptualize what you're trying to do in your interviews?
I think somewhat similar to what you also said, kind of just let your guests speak. I think I have to admit, like maybe one problem with their podcast is that I don't think too much about this. I'm just curious about something that someone wrote or did, and I just try and get that out of it. And kind of just, I think I'd say I'm trying to definitely be very open and just ask fairly open-ended questions. Often open-ended, often very specific, but I think I try to just ask open questions and let the person speak and kind of see where it goes. I think this is really difficult because I do have a structure to what I want to talk about. And so there's this, this weird balance between just letting the person speak and going like, could you like naturally move more towards that direction that I want to get to? I guess it's fairly direct in the sense that I just try to ask the question I'm interested in and maybe provide some sort of additional ideas that maybe relate to it and that make them think about it maybe in a slightly different way or something like that. Yeah, I guess one thing that I did realize that also goes back to your question about what was different than I expected is that initially I remember going in actually and thinking, okay, I should definitely try and not ask the questions that everyone else asks the guests, right? I guess that's a very standard thing. You don't want to be the person who has an interview that could exist anywhere else, and you want to ask something unique and get something new out of the guests. But then I realized after about 20 interviews or so that at least 6 or 7 had said, this is the first interview I'm doing, or I've never done a podcast interview. Because for me, it's literally, I read a paper and then I write to the author and say like, hey, do you want to talk about this? So like often it's people who have no prior experience in terms of, or very little prior experience in terms of public speaking in general and being interviewed specifically. So I think that's something where I also realized like, it's actually fine for me to do a fairly straightforward job in terms of, I know the paper, I usually know it inside out. I've usually read at least 1 or 2 other papers of the person in preparation. And then we kind of just have a chat about it. Yeah.
So there's a few things in there that I would go a little deeper on. So the first one is that you mentioned something a little while ago which is that you often have the experience of listening to these domain general podcast hosts, and you have the experience of like, oh, this would have been a better direction to take this. Why didn't they ask this question? Do you think that now, having done 50 interviews, 49, given that this is the reverse interview, do you feel that you have come through on that sort of like suspicion? Do you feel like you would have been able to attain that in the way you kind of imagined?
I don't think so. I think I just realized how difficult it is to do interviews. I guess it's especially because, these conversational ones seem like a conversation. It just seems really easy and natural. But once you actually do it, you realize, shit. I had... And the weird thing is, like, sometimes it's actually... So, for example, I would take one example, one of the last ones I did with Michael Hornberger. He's a really good guy. I had a great time talking to him. And I really liked the episode that came out of it. But somehow, whilst I was recording, he had this, the way he often spoke is he'd, talk about topic A that leads naturally to topic B. As soon as he arrives at topic B, he takes that as the starting point, starts talking about topic C, and so on and so forth. So I find it really difficult to kind of say something and get kind of my direction that I want to get into there. But when I listened to it afterwards in the edit, it's like, I should have just let him talk. I could have just not said anything. It would have been perfectly fine. But somehow it seemed like I felt like I had to guide this a bit more than I actually did. So I think I still have just lots to learn in terms of how to do this. I'm not sure I do a great job at it. I think I just try and be as prepared as I can for each interview, and then I find it really difficult also because I often have no idea who the people are I'm going to talk to. I imagine, at least for you, it's maybe you have a bit more information about the people, but there's some people, there's literally just a university website. That's all I know about them and what they wrote in the paper. So I have no idea what they sound like, how they speak, any of this stuff. So I guess it is a very inspirational, improvisational kind of thing of going, let's see how I can do this. And as I said, I'm pretty sure I'm also one of the annoying interviewers. I don't think I've transcended that yet.
We're all the annoying interviewers. That's the good news. Gosh, there's who? If you hear that, you're gonna have to take that out later on. So
I will. I'll take it. I take this. It annoys me so much, and that's why I spend so much time editing. I should automate this also. There's programs for this.
So I had a guest on a couple episodes ago named Andy Luttrell, and he has a podcast among many other things, but his podcast is called Opinion Science. And I think if you want to hear a baseline, high-ass quality podcast in terms of just like a well-produced, well-thought-out, nice to listen to, well-edited, good in terms of the quality of the content, quality of the production, that sort of thing, that's a really, really solid podcast to listen to and sort of start to reverse engineer, okay, what's happening here? And I don't do everything that he does, and we don't have exactly the same kind of thing, but that's someone who I think does and it's specifically him talking to people who are also experts in the same basic field. Not always the same exact field, but the same sort of basic, opinion science sort of content. And I think that's, looking at people like Andy and then trying to reverse engineer the different, things that they're doing, sort of like we're talking about emulating, I think is a really helpful sort of exercise for a lot of these things. And then the other thing I want to bring up is that Andy recommended a podcast. I think I've got it right here. The name of it is called The Turnaround, and the guy who hosts it is Jesse Thorne, who's evidently a dude. He's got this whole media empire, very successful as far as I can tell. And the idea of The Turnaround is that he takes people who are among the most famous interviewers in the U.S., e.g. Ira Glass. This is where I mentioned that Ira Glass thing earlier. This is where I listened to this interview with him. And he asked them about the nature of interview. And so I was expecting, okay, great. Let's go in. Let's hear, because I love this sort of thing. I love thinking about interviewing and dissecting what's happening and that sort of stuff. And I just absolutely could not fucking listen to this podcast because I thought Jesse Thorne was such a grating, an interviewer, and I just thought like he got nothing. He got the top 15 interviewers in America together and got nothing from them. And so, in addition to figuring out what you like about, Sam Harris and, for me, Krista Tippett is one of my favorite interviewers, her podcast On Being, et cetera, et cetera. Going in and saying, well, here's one that's not only just like, oh, I think this guy's kind of annoying, but I fundamentally couldn't listen to this episode and that sort of thing, and trying to reverse engineer. I think these are all really great exercises to sort of unlock that deeper, what am I trying to do here, and how can I improve on what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, it's funny that, like I obviously, knew that we were going to talk about roughly the podcast and these kind of things. But as you were asking the questions, I guess I realized that I never thought too much about interviewing itself. I mean, there are like some specific things, but yeah, I guess I don't know whether this is good or bad that I'm so like caught up in the material. I don't know whether that's a good or bad thing, but I just try and like figure out the thing and go like, how can we get from topic A to B?
Yeah.
But yeah, it seems like just yeah.
So yeah, let's set the. I think we've covered a lot of ground on the interviewing thing. I think there's some, we've covered some good stuff, and there's some stuff to think about in there. But let's go towards the material now. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the target audience. So in terms of the material, we've talked a little bit about what you're trying to do, what your goals are, et cetera, that sort of stuff. Who do you envision that kind of content in its best case scenario appealing to?
So this is actually something that I have thought about recently. And initially I had it was definitely for academics, basically for people who've read the papers. But now I've actually gotten it slightly, quite a bit broader. I'm basically assuming that the people listening to my podcast are probably junior researchers or master students, master student, PhD student, that kind of level. Maybe postdocs. That's kind of, so basically I'm using that as kind of my, let's say, those people should be able to follow the conversation. So I'm assuming, we don't explain what a neuron is or anything like that on my podcast, even though, it can be quite technical discussions. But I'm kind of assuming that the people know the basics of science. They know the basic of the brain and psychology, more or less. But the weird thing is, so this has been one of the really surprising things I've had. So, I partly assume that it's master students, PhD students who listen to this because they probably have more time than especially senior postdocs, professors, that kind of stuff. But I have occasionally found out that there are professors listening to my podcast. And apparently even
professors are people too, Ben. It's true.
Yeah, but you'd think they have stuff to do. There was this was actually relatively early on. This was the coolest thing for me at the time, when it's basically some professor wrote a paper, another different professor tweeted about it, and then someone else responded to that saying, oh yeah, this reminds me of this, a third professor responded saying this reminds me of this podcast I was listening to where Paul Smordino mentioned this thing about modeling. It's what? Don't you have I don't know, students to supervise or something?
So there's something that you've said a couple times that I want to take up and touch on. And that's that you're assuming, and you say this in front of all of your book podcasts as well. So you're assuming the book, book club ones. You stayed up front, look, I'm assuming that you've read this, by which I think you partially mean there are going to be spoiler alerts. So if you don't want to know what happens, then, but I think this assumption, particularly pertaining to the scientific research paper stuff, is the wrong one to take into it. Because I've got a Psych Archive paper up here. They tell you how much downloads there are. So this is a paper that I found really interesting. Let's see if I can get it up. I'm just picking, this is literally a tab that's open. And the downloads on this preprint, I thought it was a really good paper, really fascinating paper, totally interesting to me. 159 downloads. So if we're taking that as a proxy for the number of people, so at the end of the day, the set of people who are interested in what the paper said is going to be orders of magnitude larger than the number of people who have read it. And I think that this is sort of trying to, for you personally, I can see why you would have the inclination that, well, okay, maybe going through the summary, like let's turn the velocity, let's turn the volume up a little bit, and let's get to the good stuff a little bit quicker and not go over the basic stuff. And I think this is a pretty significant assumption, and one that is always going to be a huge limitation on, the kinds of people who are going to resonate with this concept. Because I think at the end of the day, there are lots of people from undergraduates through professors that are interested in what papers say and having an audio format in which to consume them, and to hear from the person who wrote the paper, be interviewed by someone who is knowledgeable about the area of research and the paper and can ask elucidating questions about it. There's a ton of people who, and so I think that is, the people who can do, you don't have to be like, oh, people who don't know what a neuron is. Great. Let's try and branch out to those. No. You don't need that. I think approximately you're correct, but it needs to be the set of people who are potentially interested in what the paper have to say, not the people who have already read the paper, thought about it, and seen it in their lab's own journal club, that sort of thing. I think that, to me, seems more specifically like the audience that you should have in mind. What do you think about that?
I completely agree. I mean, so this is part of also this is also part of how my thinking changed about this, where now I do let people explain what the paper is, and I ask some questions based off of that, and you don't have to have the right. So I think for my interviews, actually, I don't really do that anymore. I think that has definitely changed. For the books, I find it slightly difficult because, in some sense, one reason also why I did that is because otherwise you have to really prepare to explain what the book is and like guide people through it, and that's a very different experience. Or I think that probably takes. Yeah, it's so difficult. I mean, yeah. So as I said, I agree for the interviews, but for the books, I find it so difficult because, for example, let's say when we did the Humboldt thing, right? The Humboldt biography. I mean, I think that was actually a pretty good kind of in between.
I very much agree.
Because we didn't explain what the book was about. We didn't retell the book, right? But we kind of.
Well, you gave really good summaries of what happened.
Right.
Chapter by chapter. And
I wonder how much you're going to get from that if you have no idea what anything is about, because it was like 2 sentences per, the entire book in 40.
Anyway, let's set aside the book club thing as a substantively different sort of style of thing. And I think, yes, let's think about it and incorporate it overall. But specifically for the target audience thing, the bread and butter of your show, and maybe this is something that you want to think about changing, is like, oh, I wanted to focus more on the book club things. But I think the book club thing is sort of a side sort of thing. And yes, it's got its own parameters and it's relevant. But let's focus on the bread and butter interviews, that sort of thing.
Okay. So just the interviews. As I said, I have changed that, and I hope that I do make them more accessible now to anyone who basically has a master's, let's say, in this field, more or less. That is my hope. I mean, I do definitely still have some questions that are pretty specific. Maybe I should make a better job of introducing why the question is interesting. Yeah, I don't know how much this comes across or how well I do it, but I do definitely now try and I definitely don't assume that the people have read the paper anymore. Let's put it that way.
So we're going to transition now into talking into specifics about the show format that you've been doing, and also maybe what you've been thinking about for changes of what you want to do in the future. And so I guess I kind of have an idea that I'd like to put into the mixer of just like a thought for you to consider, which is that, so right now, the way you're framing your shows is in terms of, here's my guest. You should come listen to this show primarily because here's this person and they're going to talk about themselves, their research, their most interesting papers, that sort of stuff. Where it seems to me like what, and at the end of the day, like the people that you're bringing on, like you said, this is not a public figure show where it's like, I'm going to have Jordan Peterson on and talk to him about whatever. I'm having serious researchers on and having serious research discussions. And so it seems to me like the crux of what's interesting about the show is not necessarily the people, but the papers themselves. And so pitching each show, by which I mean the sort of title and the framing of it, as in like, look, come listen to this show because we're going to talk about this paper. And it got tweeted out by a bunch of people and they seem to find it really fascinating. And it sort of, rethinks this one paradigm in the field. And I'm going to get the author on the line, and we're going to go over what happened in the paper. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of it. We're going to talk about what we did learn from it, what we did learn from it. I'm going to probe him on some technical points. We're going to talk a little bit high-level stuff, but having it be about the paper and saying, we're going to talk about this paper, and you're going to hear from the author, and she's going to be interviewed by a knowledgeable person with relevant, expertise in something related to it. That seems to me like the core of what people would really get excited about with your show. And maybe it solves some of the other problems that will come up sort of, that we'll talk about of, your vision going forward. But it would limit the amount of time you talk to them. Because instead of it being about their entire career and body of work, it's like, let's go in depth on this paper. And so it sort of puts a natural hour limit to it. If it's less than an hour, that's fine. If it's slightly more than an hour, that's fine too. But it probably will end up being close to that sort of like hour. It gives you a natural hook for what people want to know the content of papers, and they want to hear it straight from the author. At the end of the day, people like consuming audio content. Professors are way more likely to listen to 45 minutes of your hour-long podcast with this person than they are to sit down and read the paper at the end of the day. And I think, if you get the sort of topical scope of it in terms of, here's the kind of people from this segment of cognitive science that I'm going to have on, that seems to me like you could get like that would be a sort of like next level of tapping into what's fundamentally interesting about what you are doing and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think I'm trying to find something interesting to say other than just agreeing.
Well, let's put that. That's fine. So let me put that out there as like, here is, after sort of thinking about it for a while. Like I said, I was doing 10 days worth of prep to get ready for this interview. That's sort of what occurred to me as a potential way of sort of getting to that core of what makes your show unique and what you can personally deliver. That's both true to what you want in terms of being like let's have serious conversations about serious research, but also appealing to the maximum number of people possible. But so anyway, let's talk about some specific stuff, and we can keep that sort of proposal in the background here. So let's talk about the format of the show. Your shows tend to be pretty long, and you tend to be pretty scrupulous in how you edit them. And this leads to, as a result, you have to spend lots and lots of time producing each show. And there's sort of two considerations here: the quality of the content and the amount of time you need to create it. So what do you think about what are your current thoughts on how your show is formatted? What are the things you like about it? What are the things that you think are the potential drawbacks? And what do you think you could like shave off to sort of balance that quality versus time investment trade-off?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I am already changing, or at least I'm trying to change, is to make the episodes shorter. That also in part actually goes with what you mentioned before about making it specifically about a paper. I think what I'm doing now is more, I'm not as explicit about it, but I guess I am kind of doing more like 2 papers about a person rather than, their entire career or whatever. So that's the obvious one, right? Like, if it takes me 3 times as long to edit the episode than it takes to record it, then if I take out 20 minutes, then I save, 1.5 hours total, basically.
Is that what you'd estimate it to be? Is about 3x, whatever the
probably length? I mean, so editing, also including the description of the podcast.
Which are also long in what you do. You give a lot of, you give a big description.
In and everything, yeah. So, sometimes it probably would only take 2.5 times as long, but I probably get lost sometimes and like, oh, that looks like an interesting paper, whilst I'm like trying to find the thing we were referencing. But yeah, I would probably say it takes me 3 times as long to edit the thing as it takes to record it.
Which that's huge. Like that is a limiting factor in your ability to do this show while doing a PhD. Like to me, this is almost the number one consideration for people, like PhD students specifically, who are considering starting a podcast is you need to have a really strong estimate up front is how much time it's going to take you per week to produce the kind of episode that you plan on producing.
Yeah.
And so I think like that to me is the biggest metric of your ability to continue to do this. You know, do you have that amount of time to give the show what you need while doing all the other stuff you actually have to do?
So I find this really difficult because I completely agree that probably no one cares. I mean, to be fair, I think I'm slightly over editing it probably now. I think I would imagine that sometimes maybe it would have been better to keep a little bit more pauses in or in.
And to your point, I'll admit to under editing at the present moment.
Yeah. So I think I think if I do that a bit more consistently, like editing a bit less out, then it probably, that will just 2.5 times already takes that quite a bit, right? I think it's always going to take at least 1.5 times the length because I have to listen through the thing. Yeah. But so what were we talking about?
What do you need to do? How can you be more efficient in terms of getting more of what you want with less time investment, or like the sort of maximum quality with whatever the minimal, what are some steps towards efficiency that you think you could do in your next phase?
For me, actually, first, before kind of answering that, I think I'd like to just have a slight discussion about something, because this is kind of something I feel like I have only one answer to, but you probably have a different response to this. And for me, the idea is, okay, if let's say whatever, right? So, I mean, I can try and automate that, right? I can definitely do that. And I have to remind myself not to take that out in the edit. Otherwise, no one will get what I'm talking about. But, I can automate that probably to some extent with some software. But the kind of idea I have there is it takes me maybe 5 seconds, 10 seconds to take something like that out. And it saves every listener half a second or whatever, right? I mean, this is just one example. A better example is maybe if someone says that and has a break. It takes me 5-10 seconds to take it out. It saves the listener a second or two. So basically, if I have more than like 10 listeners, I've already made a net gain on the time spent on this thing. So I feel like if I want to have actually lots of people listening to this, it would be almost rude, basically, to waste their time by having just an in there and a pause after that doesn't aid the flow of the conversation in any way. That's kind of been my approach to the whole thing, to say, like, if I have just basically anyone listening to this, it's a net gain for everyone. I don't know whether I'm taking too much on my back there, basically, but
I do like your utilitarian mindset. I think that's I'll always applaud that. And adding up the utility for you versus this, okay. But I'm not sure that, quote, time wasted is necessarily the right metric to think about that. So here's another way of thinking about it. Is that, so I mentioned an interviewer named Krista Tippett, who has a podcast called On Being. And one of the things that I've learned from Krista Tippett, who what she's trying to do is much more about the personal side of things, which is similar to, like what I talk about on my show. It's the personal side of the intellectual journey, as opposed to like, okay, let's just talk content and scientific material and that sort of stuff. But one thing that she does that at first I thought was bad was that when she's asking a question, she does this thing that I'm kind of doing now, which is she kind of works her way around it. She sort of has some like and like, well, it's kind of like this, but it's also kind of like that. And initially when I was listening to her, it was like, well, that's bad. It's bad to say it's bad to leave unnecessary space, and like it sort of has this awkwardness to it. But no, actually, when I thought about it, I realized that what she was doing was she's controlling the pace of what's happening. And she is doing what we were talking about with the sort of core capacity of interviewing, which is she's creating space. Because when someone just really laid something very bare and personal out there, you need something to kind of break that up. And also, when you're asking people personal questions, you don't really know what they're going to say to. You need you need some hedging in there to give a little bit, I could ask the question in this very short period of time, or I could kind of give a bunch of stuff to it. So that's an example where if you're editing that show and someone gives a really long pause before they answer, that's actually crucial to what they're trying to say. So there was actually this one specific interview that she does with Mary Catherine Bateson. Rest in peace, she died about a year ago. The daughter of famous anthropologist Margaret Mead Gregory Bateson. And Mary Catherine Bates, huge fucking badass in her own right, and but she was hella old at the time of this interview. And so every time Krista Tippett would ask a question, there would be like a fucking 30-second pause. No, not that big, but it felt like there was just like enough time for God to create the earth in between the end of question. But that was an important part of Mary Catherine Bates' process. And when Krista or the editor interrupted that space, because normally you wouldn't want that, I was like, well, no. I feel like the authenticity has been violated. And then we contrast that with lots of well-produced shows. For example, The Life Scientific by BBC4 with Jim, forget his last name because I don't really listen to that show. Yeah, Al Cleary. Great show and has a large listenership. And those are always exactly 30 minutes or whatever it is. And there are these, quick question, sort of direct answer. Quick question, sort of direct answer. And so that's a very different thing so it all comes back to, what are your goals? Who are you trying to appeal to as the audience? And what does that kind of content look like? And so to me, the answers to those questions answer what is the appropriate level of editing and what you're trying to get out of it. What should you leave in? What should you take out? How do you find that balance? To me, always comes back to those sort of core questions,
Yeah, I think that's maybe also why, for me, it makes more sense to take stuff out, because sometimes there are some personal things in there, but not that much. I do try and keep interesting or useful pauses in there. So, for example, if I ask a question and they really want to think about it, then I won't cut to them answering immediately. But I agree with you. I think because of that, maybe in mind, it's a bit more necessary. But actually, the main reason I think why it takes me so long to edit the podcast, and this is something that maybe you have a way around this, I don't know. The problem is, as I said, lots of my guests have no experience public speaking, and they have no experience in listening to themselves. So I literally have episodes where I have a 2-hour episode and I take arms out, and then it's 1:45. Where people will, I'm not joking, there are episodes that would be borderline unlistenable to if the people say interesting things, but they just have tics that they aren't aware of because they've never been interviewed.
Yeah.
So I have genuinely multiple episodes where I took up 5 to 10 minutes of them just having untrained public speaking, basically. And yeah, I mean, those are the ones that kill me. 2-hour ones, the way I take out 15 minutes.
It seems to me that maybe.
So just briefly, my question kind of slightly was then, in part, this is because the guests I have are people you would not hear about otherwise, which I think is in part maybe a selling point, something really cool about my podcast. Because
I agree.
Actually, the ones that did the best, my episodes, are often those with people who have never been interviewed, and I think that's a really cool thing. But it also means, on the flip side, that those take longer to edit. If I'm assuming, for example, with Steven Pinker, for example, it would take less to edit because he's more precise in his speech, and I'm assuming uses less filler words, or fewer filler words, he would probably say. But do you see what I mean? There's a kind of conflict here.
Yeah. It seems
I could just invite professors, but yeah.
No. I think that it's more than just that. I think it's a core question about the identity of your show. This whole how should I edit it is, like I said, it's like you have to be really clear on the objectives and the identity questions in order to be able to answer them. And so here's just, kind of here's a take on it for you to consider, is that you're kind of doing so I painted 2 bookends with the On Being style of episode versus the Life Scientific, and you're kind of straddling a strange both world that I think might be suboptimal, which is that you are kind of giving the space that Krista Tippett would in On Being, with the kind of almost the promise or something like that of the Life Scientific format. That like really what you should be doing instead of worrying about taking out ums is you should be taking out passages and say, well, look, this person said some interesting things. They also said a lot of not interesting things. It's not their fault. They are a researcher, and this is how researchers work. And when you interview with them, and so having here is the 30 minutes, here is the hour of the most interesting high density things they said, and pasting that together in a coherent way rather than taking out these small sort of ticks and those sort of things. That could be potentially the way to do it, rather than if you're going to spend 3 hours editing an episode, that seems to me like what you want to be doing rather than worrying about the small sort of things. Because, like, honestly, having listened to some of your episodes, some of the things that the people say on there are not super fascinating and could they could be cut. Like, honestly, I think some things that some people say on there, and this is true of every show, I'm sure, like all podcasts could be cut and the like literally just removed from the face of the earth. We'd all still continue to live, but no, I like, but so like as a different way of conceptualizing the editing process, but like, look, I'm gonna find the hours worth of the most interesting things they said, and I'm gonna take those and put them together rather than just taking out the sort of the ticks, that sort of thing. And I think when you combine that with the the paper forward focus, maybe that's, then you start to get really like, okay, we're bringing the scope into the most interesting topic, the highest sort of density of interestingness in the topic. And then we're going to say, we're going to aim for 45 minutes. We're going to aim for whatever, and say like, okay, I'm going to try and find approximately 45 minutes of that. So that cuts down on the editing time. It increases in two ways the density of interestingness and that sort of thing. So that's just like a way of conceptualizing a potential, another potential way of doing things.
A quick question about that. Do you think that's going to take less time? Because I found like sometimes I had to take out parts, like for whatever reason, because someone said, can you take that out afterwards or something? And I found that takes more time than
that
actually
takes
taking
a long
out
time.
arms. Because then you really have to like know what's in your episode.
Yeah. So that I agree with that. And that's, again, it's about the management sort of thing. But if you're constraining the original conversation to an hour, and you are also bringing down the topic space to something that is more reliably interesting, then I don't think you need to do very much cutting it down. But yes, thinking about the parameters of all that sort of stuff in terms of time management and time allocation, I think is crucial. But I do think maybe if you get the scope of the initial conversation correct, then the editing becomes a nice to have, or you can sort of then say, here's what I'm willing to dedicate to it, and that sort of thing,
Yeah. Yeah, I think... Yeah, I have to think about that. Yeah.
So here's something that you mentioned that you are kind of interested to think a little bit more about. And the way that I conceptualize this is what I call distribution. And this is different than the quality and the content of the show itself, but it's how it gets out there into the world. And so from my point of view, I spend a lot of time sort of studying entrepreneurs, I guess you could call them, because I think it's a very high performance field. As opposed to PhD students, who in general I would say are a field where we simply aren't, it's not part of our cultural norms, our social norms, to cultivate sort of like high performance sort of routines and that sort of stuff, and optimal environments. We PhD students live in a very suboptimal sort of professional milieu. Yeah. Setting that aside, anyway, one thing I see a lot of these people say is that distribution matters in many ways more than product. And so I think as scientists, we kind of are trained to think, well, if the quality is good enough, then it'll get out there eventually. And I think, for science, yeah, sure, maybe. And I think it does, but, potentially quite slowly. But when you start to really look at what performs well in your field, and by that, I mean, not just, like scientifically, which I do think this is true for, but also podcasts and whatever content you're trying to produce, content in the broadest sense. It is not necessarily the highest quality stuff that comes to the forefront, but the stuff that's a part of the best sort of distribution system, and the marketing and the flashiness and the stickiness, the shareability, and whatever the different things in there. So, and this is something that I struggle with a lot. It's something I have a lot of thoughts about. It's a lot of things that I want to do, but things that I find that I don't usually have the time to do and all that sort of stuff. So how do you currently think about the distribution for your show, and what would you like to see? How do you sort of envision it going forward?
By distribution, you mean more the marketing, advertising, or whatever you want to call it, rather than like how I get it to a repository.
Yeah, not the literal logistics of, I got it to Spotify, but well, let's say there's 100 people for whom this show is potentially of, interest in my target market. How do I make sure all of those 100 people have an opportunity to engage with the show initially?
So far, I've basically only done one thing, and that's I tweet about it, and I include the Twitter handle of the person in the show. And that actually works fairly all right, I'd say. The only problem is, again, I have lots of guests who don't have any online presence at all. So then I have lots of guests. Yeah, I once had a month where I think out of 4 episodes, one person had a Twitter account or something. So then obviously, no one listens to those episodes. But yeah, so that's something that basically I so far have done fairly little on. I have noticed, though, a bit of a network effect, I feel like, because now especially recently, I've had a lot of episodes on special navigation, grid cells, play cells, that kind of stuff. And those actually are starting to do disproportionately well. And I think the reason is that by now I can say like, hey, here's like 5 other episodes on this topic I have. And then so often now previous guests will be like, oh, that person is now on the podcast, and we'll retweet it. So that's actually working pretty well. But it doesn't really work for like standalone episodes or something like that. So, I mean, the first initial answer to your question is that's pretty much what I do. But I realize that there is probably more to do. I mean, I recently made a Reddit account. I haven't done anything with it yet. In principle, that should be a community that would be really interested in this. But I don't know. That's something I kind of want to try out for the next, I don't know, maybe from next year or something onwards. But yeah, I don't know. To be fair, I don't really know what exactly one can do. That's kind of part of my problem also. Sure, I could because, I have no social media other than like Twitter accounts with 20 followers. So I have, it's not like I could start a TikTok account and get famous there, but right, like that's not really an option here.
It's not really authentic into your
yeah, and it's also more work than anything else. So yeah, to be fair, I don't really know what the options are. Twitter is an easy one that seems to work to some extent, but yeah, what are you thinking about? Because yeah, I know you have Twitter too. I guess your newsletter, but. Is that
so I struggle with distribution for my show because that's the first thing that I cut when I have less time to dedicate to it. And right now in this, sort of last few months, I'm in this sort of like final step of like wrapping up my PhD. Like I'll be finished with, so it's December 1 right now. I'll be finished with writing at my empirical chapters by the end of the year. So I'm just like, and then I'll be like way ahead of schedule. And then starting January 1, I'll be able to rededicate, the majority of my time to, okay, how do I build my various like platforms, that sort of stuff. And that's really going to be a more distribution focused time for me. But I'll admit, like that's the first thing that gets cut for me. And, that, I don't even tweet out, most of my episodes these days. And at the end of the day, right now, what I'm trying to do is more just get to that 100 episode mark. I'm at like 74 as of this week. And so that's kind of just what I'm focusing on. I sort of know what the show's about right now, how it works. And, I want to get on as many famous psychology people as I can while I'm still a graduate student. And then once I sort of stop being a graduate student and start doing other things and whatever, I think my perspective is going to change a little bit. But anyway, that's just the sort of phase that I'm in. And it's a not necessarily distribution focused phase. However, I do think distribution is very important in terms of getting your show to as many people in your audience of potential listeners as possible. So part of it has to do with, okay, who's that target audience? And, we sort of talked about that for you earlier, which is, one way that we talked about was masters and onwards people who have interest in the specific papers that you are covering. And so that gives us a pretty clear idea of who they are. And so here's one really simple thing that you could do that I think it's not, it's not the end all be all, but it's something that makes a lot of sense, which is that you can contact the social media coordinators, the communication coordinators of the people in the department of the person that you interviewed, right? Because if you interview a postdoc in, Oxford experimental psychology, then you can reach out to the social media coordinator and be like, yo, I just interviewed this person about their recent research. They're a member of your department, and you've got a newsletter, you've got a Twitter, you've got your media section of your website. And it's not like that's a gazillion people who read the, newsletter, but it's definitely a large number of people in your target audience. And that social media coordinator, I can tell you from experience, is fucking thrilled to have someone reach out to them with oh, here's some content for you. So their ass doesn't have to do it on their own. So that's something that's a pretty easy thing to do, to find that person, to send them a quick message, be like, hey, I had this person on podcast. They're part of your thing. Would you be willing to share this when you get a chance on whatever, channels you think are appropriate? That's something that you can do that definitely is going direct to your target audience.
Yeah, I never thought about that. I have thought sometimes of, especially when the guest didn't have Twitter, I've considered including the university in the handle or whatever. But yeah, I never considered actually contacting someone and saying hey, can I help you with the job, basically?
The social media coordinators, yeah, they write back to you right away.
Rebecca Sachs?
Yeah, I think so.
Did from MIT there or something like that?
Yeah. I think BCS is, because I've had a bunch of MIT brain and cognitive science people on there. So, but again, it's something that I do inconsistently, and so it would be an ideal. But no, I think you talked about it with Lex Friedman at the top of the episode. Is that it's not a mystery, the main things that people do to sort of introduce new people to the show. It's, if you have video is just so much more shareable than audio.
Well, YouTube has a recommendation algorithm that doesn't exist for podcasting.
People come across YouTube videos much more easily than they come across audio. So even if your thing doesn't make sense as a YouTube video, having video on there. But again, it's a bunch of work, and it's well, not a lot of people are watching this to start off with, and so I think that's a nice to have. And I've seen some people go really hard on it, saying yo, if you want your podcast to grow, you need to be video first.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've heard that too.
I don't know. Probably.
Well, that's a different product, yeah.
So there's that, and then there's the basically little clips that you were mentioning that are anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes long. I've done those at various times, and you can sometimes people don't care about it. Sometimes they do get shared if it's a clip that resonates, or
I found
the right person shares
just
it.
Briefly, I found that so much more work than I thought it would be. I did that once when I thought I can do an audio excerpt on Twitter. That would be a good thing, right?
100%.
And then, God, that was a lot of work. Just getting a 30-second, 1 minute clip on there. And then I showed it to someone, and that was a weird clip. I was oh.
And you got to have the text on there, and you got to have the, if it's just audio only, it's not going to work. It's got to have the subtitles, and you got to pick which 30 seconds. Out of context. Yeah, and whatever. So all of these, that's the problem with distribution, is that all of these things are yet another layer on there that you have to dedicate time to. If you already spent 3 hours editing the fucking episode, you're not going to want to, spend the time to do all of the stuff on top of it. And the other thing that we haven't talked about yet, but I think is crucial to a lot of this stuff, is that a lot of these things require different mindsets. They require wearing different hats, right? So when you're conducting an episode versus when you're editing it versus when you're producing it versus when you're listening to it, these are all very different mindsets. And the biggest discrepancy in terms of the sort of like back end of things for me is that production versus distribution change in mindset. Because all of the editing, like, as the host, and slash editor, you are in your mind like, okay, this is a good section. I'm gonna have to take an out. This section isn't quite as interesting. Like, whatever. All of that sort of monologue is sort of naturally running through your head in there. And yes, there's a difference between editing for sound and editing for content and that sort of stuff. But you can start to put those things together. Thinking about the content itself versus the distribution of it is a totally different mindset. And you can want the show to be as high quality as possible, but then like not be bothered to do the distribution stuff that we're talking about, which is all fairly straightforward and fairly obvious. It's not like you need this revolutionary idea about what to do. It's just that, well, are you going to take the time to do the videos? Are you going to take the time to do the clips? How many people are you going to contact to try and send it out in their newsletter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, it takes so much time. I mean, actually, do you know that Lex Friedman, he had his entire thing, the in-person interviews, the editing, the videos, the clips, he did all of that for like the first 120 episodes himself. Like, I have absolutely no idea how he did that. That's so much work, especially he has like 3-hour ones, right? It's ridiculous. But one point, maybe last point for me on this topic that I can think about is, I think what I'm kind of experimenting with, or not even experimenting with, but I actually find more interesting to do in the future is also to be slightly more, to focus my podcast around a few themes. Because right now it's kind of neuroscience, psychology, whatever. But I've realized, for example, with spatial navigation, right? Like, I've taken 2 or 3 modules in my master's that were vaguely related or closely related to this. I kind of know the papers. I know the background. I know the history of the field, right? So for me, for example, doing an interview there with someone who has a new paper out, so much less work than if I read something that I just came across for the first time and I don't really know what it's about. And I've noticed, for example, one really interesting thing is, so I don't know what it's like for you, but for me, and I think most creative outputs, let's say, you have this exponential decay in terms of downloads, right? Like when it comes out first day, you get most of your downloads, and then it just falls off exponentially after that. Interestingly, with Kate Jeffrey, who is someone who works in spatial navigation and was one of my episode 15 or something like that, I have a U shape right now. Like, my last few, I've literally had as many downloads in the last month, half a year after I had the first one. And I think that's because I had 3 guests on a roughly similar topic. So, and I realized, like, it's actually easier to do. It's probably more fun to do because I'm not jumping around topic completely every week. And it seems like people also like it because they can see, like, oh yeah, you're kind of, I guess when you're listening to something the first time, you're also testing out the podcast in general. So my hope is kind of that I'm building like a small library on like this spatial navigation cognitive maps thing. And then I'll do a few others maybe more related to my actual PhD work and kind of see how that goes.
I super support that. Like, this is something I put in my notes for you, is that one thing to consider is tightening down the scope of what you're doing, as opposed to having it be this like the set of all potential cognitive scientific topics. Which, that's like what you're saying about the spatial navigation thing, 100%. I think that tightening it down to a pretty narrow scope and say, like, hey, look, we're going to talk technically about these things and go in depth on that. That's the perfect intersection of the level of technicality that you want to do. And also people, but, oh, right, here's this other person and here's this other paper, that sort of thing. That seems to me like a sweet spot, is tightening in the topical scope of that. And you can sort of figure out the distribution that you want to have on that, like the statistical distribution, where it's like, well, for the next 20 episodes, 80% of them are going to be on a sort of, relatively narrowly defined topic, and then 20% are going to be whatever sounds interesting to me. And so having a clear focus, that when someone finds your show who's interested in that thing, they're like, oh shit, look at all these other episodes. Great. I'm going to listen to all of them. But then there's also, for your own interest and for other people, there's sort of that expansion thing. And then, or over time, like, you're not going to do spatial navigation from now until forever. So like saying, okay, here is sort of for the near future, I'm going to sort of focus in on this topic, and then I'm going to shift to that next. I think that's a really, really good, sort of to tighten in on that scope like that.
Yeah, and also it's so much. I guess I also, to go back to your first question or whatever question, like I also underestimated how much like mental time you spend thinking about the upcoming interview. And if you're doing 1 or 2 interviews a week, and it's just a completely different topic every time. It's just such a jump.
Do you spend a lot of do you have a lot of like that mental lead time like that?
Yeah, quite a lot. Okay, I guess you don't.
I don't think that I do. I don't know. I definitely think, oh, I'm going to talk to this person. What do I think is going to be interesting? But I start thinking about the episode 30 minutes beforehand, unless I'm reading something of theirs because we're going to discuss it specifically.
Okay, no, I have usually my notes scripted out a few days before. I mean, often also not, but that's at least the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and for me, it's the kind of whole thing of just thinking about this topic, and yeah. It's taking up more of my life than it probably should.
But you need to actually know shit going in, whereas I don't necessarily have the.
Yeah, I mean, the first 10 minutes of your interview is like, where did you grow up?
Yeah. Which could have been there's plenty of Canada answers for what's most annoying about Cody. I'm sure we could have a whole podcast and just coming up with those. But
I mean, that wasn't even by the way, that wasn't even a part of the what's annoying about your criticism. It's just a very, I feel like to some extent you have to maybe be a bit more spontaneous, because it's more like, what do you pick up on it there?
Yeah. Part of what I'm doing in the first 15 minutes of an episode is I'm listening, or 15 minutes of an interview, is I'm listening to what is this person able to give me? Because a lot of academics, you'd be like, tell me about your personal life. And it's just fucking boring. They just don't have anything interesting to say about it. And some people can only do theories and philosophies. Some people can tell great anecdotes. Some people, and so you're trying to feel out what is the thing this person is best at giving, that if I ask them questions that are sort of tailored towards that for the next 45 minutes, that they're going to give me the best of themselves. Because that's constantly what I'm asking is how do I get the best out of this person? And in that first 10, 15 minutes, assessing what it is they're most comfortable talking about and the style in which they're comfortable talking about it. And then making sure my questions are tailored throughout like that. That's a lot of what I'm doing in the first 15 minutes of an interview. But anyway, the scope is something I struggle with because, I have on potentially far too wide of a scope. Like some of my favorite people that I have on. So, I mean, I have lots of sort of core cognitive scientists and psychology people and everything. And I think that's recognizably what my core is. But then like some of my favorites are like, my interview with the English professor, Luc Menand. And it's like no one else who listens to the podcast knows that. I mean, he's super famous. He's a New Yorker writer. He's like the most famous cultural critic in America. From an academic perspective. But if you're a psychologist, you don't fucking know that. You just don't. I struggle thinking like, should I have another sociologist on, even though I don't know anything about sociology, or should I like go back to my core bread and butter psychology people? I struggle with that. That's good.
To be honest, I almost find the non-psychologists the most interesting on your podcast. If I'd have to like spontaneously say like the episodes I remember the most, there would be probably the one with Luminant, then the one with Mark Granovetter. Mm-hmm. I don't know what his name is, but there was a guy who wrote a biography of a South American writer.
Ben Moser. The South American writer was Clarice Lispector. And then later on, he wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography on Susan Sontag.
Right, yeah. So I really like that one. And I guess those three are those ones that immediately popped to mind. Yeah, not your core thing. But actually, can I ask you a question that's... I wonder what your answer to this is, because I was kind of thinking about like how feasible it is to do a kind of show long term. And I thought mine is basically infinitely, right? I just need a few papers that someone's written, then I can interview them. And I have several guests where I know they're going to do something cool is going to come out the next year and I might talk to them again, that kind of thing, right? Super easy. And then I was thinking about your podcast. And at some point I thought like, you're kind of going usually, at least at the beginning, I guess it's slightly changed recently, but you're kind of going for the big names in psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, that kind of thing. And it seems to me like at some point, I don't know what that point is, but there's only a limited amount of people you can ask kind of about their career. So at some point, I was wondering, like, have you kind of dug yourself a slight hole whereby, like, or not dug a hole, but like created a format that's going to exist for 150 episodes, and then you've kind of run through them.
This is something that I'm actually dealing with at the present moment. And I sort of alluded to it a little bit previously, which is that I'm like, okay, it makes sense to interview psychologists about their careers, famous psychologists about their careers, specifically while I'm a PhD student, because I'm asking them largely about their sort of early career, sort of PhD like era experiences and that sort of thing. And yeah, like part of like I've gone through waves of different things, of different feelings about how I invite people on, but certainly my initial strategy was to invite on my heroes. And I don't know if like big name academics are such a limited, like thing that like, okay, well, I'll eventually run out of those. But certainly the people who like it occurs to me to sort of like have a sort of romanticized image of and be like, oh my God, wow, if they were on the show. And those are the people that have started to sort of run out. And now I need to be more creative on like who, yeah. And it is like I go back and forth and like all the different ways to think about this. But at the end of the day, because I sort of set out as my task, well, I'm going to talk to a large number of cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience people about their sort of personal trajectories and doing their research. I'm going to essentially finish that project to like some degree of finishedness. And I recently put together a list of like, okay, over the next 6 months, here are the, like, I just literally went through every school, every psychology program of like every sort of major university in the US and in UK, just to have a bounded set. And be like, okay, I'm just going to go through the names of all the psychologists that I either personally find their work really interesting or are objectively quite famous and like the appropriate person to kind of like talk to about this sort of thing. So I recently made that list. And part of what I want to transition to in the future is, it's a question that I'm asking myself, how is that changing with where I'm at personally, and coming to the sort of denouement of graduate school. And I also find myself being less and less interested in the stories of scientists because I've hit a lot of the same thing. I sort of get the idea. It's like there's less and less stuff that's surprising me about it. I still value individual stories, but it's going to have to at some point transcend the stories of scientists specifically. And I also have started toying with being more content focused. I've been listening to a lot of the Ezra Klein show recently. He doesn't give a shit about people's personal backgrounds. Ezra Klein is so good at being, sort of having incisive content-based. He's, as far as I can tell, of people I listen to, he's the master of incisive content-based sort of conversations. And that's an infinite sort of pool to draw from. But someone, for example, like Tim Ferriss, that is someone who is like, I'm going to look at high performers. I'm going to ask them how they do high performance in their specific thing. And so that is, you could see an easy pivot, in both domain and the sort of style from what I'm doing to something like that. So there's a number of different ways that I'm conceptualizing it, but it's certainly something that's in flux that I'm trying to finish the project that I started and sort of cap that off and then figure out how I want to transcend that later on.
Yeah, makes sense. I have one guest suggestion, which I've always wondered when I saw his name. I thought like this would be someone for Cody, maybe, but he's probably too old. Albert Bandura. He's like 104 years old or something. Like he published papers at like 39 or something like that. Like he's like one of the most cited psychologists ever. And he's been working for like 70 years or something like that. And
so I just pulled up, I emailed him on August 18th, 2020. And I sent him a letter. And he said, Dear Cody, I cannot say no to a charming letter. Let's find a mutually convenient time for the podcast. Warm regards, Albert Bandura. And then I emailed him back on August 25th, which was the day that he emailed me. And then November 15th. And then,
sorry, this year or last year?
That's November 15th, 2020. And then March 1st of this year, 2022. So I emailed him back, trying to follow up on it and never got around it, which is fair for the aforementioned reason of being like 100 whatever years old. But I came close, but unfortunately,
what's funny?
Cigar.
As you were typing, as you were searching your email, I thought like, does he not know who Albert Bandura is? Is he searching Google Scholar like who this guy is?
Exactly. Oh yeah, Albert Bandura. Oh, I love his work. Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, that's just the person. I have no idea what he would sound like these days. I mean, if you're that old, Jesus. But it must be super interesting to see like how. I mean, he has like a very big perspective on
The oldest
science. But
person
like,
I had on was a guy named Bill Labov, who's a linguist. And essentially, well, so that's why I love this guy. So basically, you could make an argument that he is the second most influential linguist of the 20th century after Noam Chomsky. But Noam Chomsky is, an order of magnitude more influential than him. And Chomskyan ideas have dominated linguistics over the 20th century, and even to some extent to this day, though less so. But Bill Labov is essentially the anti-Chomsky. So Chomsky studied language without actually ever listening to what anyone ever says. You have colorless green ideas sleep furiously, right? That's the classic Chomskyan utterance. No one before Chomsky ever fucking said that sentence, right? Whereas Bill Labov took an entirely different approach to language by focusing in on like really, really listening to like the sort of intimate details of how people actually speak, and constructed his language, so sort of linguistic space off of that. But anyway, massively influential linguist. And I talked to him when he was like 98 or something like that, and the guy was still writing stuff, and it was still solid. He couldn't talk really, and he couldn't keep coherent threads of conversation going. So I ended up heavily editing that episode to be me narrating what I find interesting about the chap, interspersed with his. So that was one of my more heavily edited episodes. But yeah, he was, close. You go on and on. I think he's turned 100. He's still alive and kicking. He just accepted a big, basically one of the biggest prizes in social science recently, the Tuckett Parsons Prize.
yeah, but I asked one guy who was like 85 or something, and he didn't ever responded, and I don't know really whether
they don't use email. Octogenarians, nonagenarians, they don't use. They like. If I were 9 years old, I sure as hell wouldn't be sitting there waiting for some, PhD student to email me. So
I might call the department or something. He has like an emeritus, but yeah,
send him a letter.
Yeah, exactly. What's his physical address?
Anyway, let's start to wrap this up. And I guess my sort of final sort of thing here is that we've talked quite a bit about what you've done, how you sort of thought about it before you did it, what you learned as you were doing it, and sort of some ways of potential, how to conceptualize in the future. Is there anything else in terms of that sort of future sort of perspective, forward-looking, is there anything in there in that space of things that you still want to talk about or sort of summarize, or anything comes to mind that we haven't sort of talked about on that front?
Not that I can think of right now. I think that the main things we've kind of covered, especially like the time commitment and the framing of the podcast. And I think some of the stuff you said I'll really think about and probably incorporate / already plan to.
Yeah. No, it sounds like a lot of the stuff that sort of occurred to me had also occurred to you, but yeah, I think the sort of maybe even like have episode titles be like, here is the paper. If you're interested in this paper or even the title of the paper, come listen to this episode, as opposed to this author that you may or may not have ever heard of, or have them both on there, but feature the paper as in like, this is why you should come listen to this episode. So they come for that. And then they stay for like, okay, here is a knowledgeable, technically savvy, thoughtful person interviewing the author. And for any paper that I'm potentially interested in that I see on this guy's show, I'll come back and listen to that. I can see that being, oh yeah, next level, really good stuff, and solving a lot of the problems that we were talking about, like the scope of the length of episodes, and getting some of those network effects that we were talking about by dialing in the scope of the topical, sort of space that you're talking about and everything like that. And making it so there's less necessity for editing and all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm, yeah, it's funny. Whilst you were saying, I thought like, I don't really want to do one paper. I'll probably do 2 papers per episode. But then I thought like, no, just try it. Just
I heard
try
that
it.
in the way that you were talking about it. You refused to acknowledge, like when you were paraphrasing what I was saying. You're like, yeah, I could do the thing where it's like 2 papers. I'm like, no, 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 no. That isn't what I said.
Okay.
That is not what I said. If you listen back, you would no point acknowledged the possibility of doing the 1 paper thing, which is fine. I mean, you're a glutton for punishment. That's why you started a podcast in the first place. But
no, but as you were saying it now, I was thinking, yeah, just try it. Just give it 2-3 episodes and see what happens. And I guess I will.
I could see that if you can stomach it, I could see that working quite well. But I'll leave you with one last small idea, which is I do think you should slap a bit of music on there and a short intro to who the person is or something. I think you should. I think the jumping straight into it, I think you need more to go on. I know part of your theory is that people will learn about this person during the episode, but I think that just like, if you already are in love with the guest, then fine, that works. But given that your guests are mostly people who people aren't necessarily going to know that well, unless they're a part of that field, then you really need to give me even 30 seconds on, well, why are you interested in this person? Why should I be interested in this person? Who are they? What have they done? And that at least gives me something to go on. Like I'll bear with you then for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it's going to be, based off of that, So I do think you don't have to go full Andy Luttrell. Here's my, sort of super shiny podcast, bouncy music, super produced sort of thing. But I think you need to slap a little something on there up front.
How do I find good music? Because I feel like your music is alright. I actually really like the last, your outro, I think is the best part of your music. I think the first one is slightly too in your face. It's like, dum, da, da, da. It's like, oh, Jesus Christ. But it's pretty good, actually. But yeah, I find like pretty much every podcast music I've listened to is really cringeworthy and bad. I don't know why. I don't think I've ever listened to.
But it's like the host. Every host is annoying. You still gotta have a host. So I think it's just one of those, something to think about.
I've been thinking.
It doesn't have to be a lot. Like listen to Sam Harris's things. It's like 2 chords. It's a single cadence. It's just one chord that leads into another.
Wait, not anymore though, right? It used.
He's changed his music a bunch.
Now it's like some weird. The first time I haven't listened to his podcast in like half a year now or something. But I remember it was this like really minimal kind of thing, and then suddenly he changed it to some sort of like rock thing where I thought at first
that was short lived. That was really? I don't remember when it happened,
so
but
bad. Okay.
And everyone wrote in to say how much they hated it, and then he changed it back.
But like
that's but that's an example of like it's literally it might not even be like a full. It might even just be like a single ominous chord. I think something like that. It doesn't have to be like like a whole sort of whatever. Like the guys from It's Very Bad Wizards, which is a big relatively well listened to social science podcast.
So I was just laughing because when I talked to Dan Quintana, I asked like what he listens to, and he said Ezra Klein and what's it called again? Wizards. I keep forgetting. Very Bad Wizards. Those were 2 of the 3 he mentioned.
100%. So these guys, and they've been in the podcast game for 10 years, and they, the guy's name, he's my homie. I can't remember his name at the moment though, but he creates a novel like beat track for every episode, every 2 weeks.
Is that a good idea though? Like
it's
you
lose terrible
recognizability, right?
It's a terrible idea.
Okay.
But
but no, I mean, yeah.
But he started doing it, so he had to continue doing it.
No, I mean, I definitely know what you mean. I mean, I've made obviously a very explicit choice to not do what anyone else is doing. And to some extent, often people do things because there's a reason, because it's a good reason to do it. And I have been thinking about adding like an introduction or something. But
let's just say put it on your list of things to reevaluate. I think I can see what you're going for in that it's about getting down to the it's the same part of your inclination where we want to skip the summary and go straight to the technical details. It's that same inclination to like, let's strip away the bullshit. Let's just get to the good stuff. So I can see where you came up with it. I think you need to reevaluate it.
See what you're doing? It's not working.
So, on that note,
Okay,
Ben,
thank you.
thank you for coming on your own podcast today.
Thank you.
It's always a good time to talk.
It's great to be on my own podcast.
It's fun to talk about tricks of the trade and all this sort of stuff. So I really enjoyed this, and I'm excited to see what you end up implementing from what we talked about. Because I think there's some good ideas in here, and I think there's some next level stuff to uncover in your whatever your next phase is.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I think it's similar for yours. I guess it's going to be interesting to see you finishing your thing and what's going to come after that.
Yeah, I'm excited. Like I said, I've been dialing in on the PhD stuff, and I've also been doing a lot of behind the scenes writing stuff. So not the newsletter, not sort of publishing individual freelance stuff, but those are both coming to their conclusion sort of at the end of this calendar year, and then it'll be about, okay, let's get back to right now. Like I said, just keep producing episodes sort of in the way I've been doing, and now it's like, okay, well, let's revisit that and really try and take it to the next level. So I'm looking forward to seeing what comes of that as well.